Hi everyone, my name is Ashna Sisodia and you're watching this course on international relations. This particular session is going to be important for PSIR optional. So for those of you, those who have chosen PSIR optional in UPSC for next year's attempt, they'll be highly benefited from this session. I understand that a lot of students are facing difficulties with respect to international relation, the applied IR part. Every time you open the newspaper, there is some sort of an article on India China relations, on India Japan, on India US. I understand that a lot of it you might not be able to process or comprehend. So, keeping that in mind, I am bringing for you guys this particular session where I will be giving you a fair idea of how to prepare for this section. Particularly, we will be discussing India China relations here with all the facts, with all the figures, as well as the analytical part, especially the expert commentaries, which you find very difficult to prepare. We'll be understanding that, we'll be analyzing those things in this particular class. So let us start with international relation. Before starting anything, let me very quickly discuss the strategy for IR. I call this as BMW strategy. What is this BMW strategy? That whenever you are going for international relation, always first of all cover bilateral relations. Bilateral relationship. Bilateral means the relationship between two countries. In this case, India China relationship, India Japan, India US, India European Union, as well as India and Russia relationship. These are the most important. Apart from that, bilateral relationship with India's neighbor, that is also important, like India Myanmar relationship, India and South Asian neighbors. I'm talking about Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, Afghanistan, and Maldives. So, on a bilateral level, you have to cover these countries. Once you are done with bilateral relationship, then you have to cover multilateral, then switch to multilateral relationship where you can cover India and ASEAN, apart from that India Central Asia relationship. Then you may go for India and Africa relationship, India and Latin America relationship, and India and West Asia relationship. And once you are done with multilateral, then you can cover world institutions, world organizations. Those topics you have to cover. So, the right strategy is first understand bilateral relations. Typically, the global center of power should be your priority. Once you are done with that, then you have to go multilateral and then world institutions. So, that is BMW strategy. And whenever you are covering these topics, I will suggest you to first focus on the factual part. So, if you are well aware about the factual realities of these countries, it will be easy for you to remember the analytical stuff. Why? Because for once only you have to cover the facts, and when it comes to analytical, I think this keeps on repeating again and again. So, I believe that for international relation, it may seem dynamic to you, but 90 to 95% of it is static. Static, I'm talking about in terms of whatever developments are going on. There's not, any major development that you will see in any year. So, whatever you must be covering will be happenings of the past only. So, you may be able to, take a crux out of it and will be able to produce a good answer with the help of whatever we will study in that static section. So for me, I will be putting whatever we have, like witnessed from 1947 till 2022, till mid of 2022, or right now it's October, right? So almost till October 2022, I'll be putting it in static category. And whatever will be the developments in future from now on, from this section, from this session onward, we will be putting it in dynamic category. But you will see that the dynamic part, it will not be difficult to prepare. It's easy rather. Okay, so let's start with it. First of all, let's take a note of important facts for international relation, the latest facts that we find in 2022. And when I say 2022, it is still going on. So whatever data that I have updated here, it is till the end of 2021. Okay? It means for 2022, we are in the mid, almost the end of it, 2 months are left, but still I am going to count it under officially 2020 data will be taken wherever it is possible. And because we had pandemic in 2020 and 2019, end of 2019 is when it started, so almost complete 2020 and 2021 was taken over by pandemic. So mostly whatever data we may not find for 2021 or 2020, we will be referring to 2018 data or 2019 data. It will be relevant. Okay, so let's talk about 2022. So in this context, if we look at the GDP of China right now, this is important. You have to know that it is somewhere 16 to 17 trillion dollars, whereas the GDP of US is 22.7 trillion dollars. Now US is having the largest GDP in those terms. In nominal terms, it is the largest economy. And China stands at the second position, which is 16 trillion dollars. And after US, and then at second position there's China, at third position there is Japan. Japan has a GDP of 5.5 trillion dollars. And after Japan, we have Germany at the fourth position, and the GDP of Germany is somewhere around 4.4 trillion dollars. And after Germany comes India, and India's GDP stands at, it was 3.1 trillion dollars. Now it is said that India is somewhere at 3.25 trillion dollars. So roughly 3 above we will take it. And Russia is also important for us. So I am here taking in account of the major powers, right? That is China, US, India, Russia, Japan, So if we take Russia, the GDP is 1.7 trillion dollars. And although European Union is very significant, I'm not taking it because European Union is a bloc where there are only 27 countries as of now. So European Union, it doesn't represent the complete, or combined GDP of the European continent. That's why we are not taking European Union here into account, but separately when we'll be covering India European Union GDP, its facts and figures we will be covering. That's when I will be discussing it separately. Okay. So there is GDP of China, there is GDP of US, GDP of India, this is Russia, and this is Japan. So we have seen this. So India is at 5th position. Okay. And then we have, let's talk about the defense expenditure, by the way. Well, the highest defense expenditure we have is by US. US has spent last year $778 billion in defense only, whereas China has spent last year $252 billion. In case of India, the expenditure in defense sector was $72.9 billion. You have to remember all these numbers, by the way. You are an international relations student. You are preparing for PSIR. You should be aware of these data. Can be asked in interview. This adds up a lot of authenticity to your answer whenever you write these data, these figures. Okay. Then we have defense expenditure of Russia, which is $61 billion last year. So therefore, going by this data, if we have to name the 5 biggest military spender in 2020, we'll see US is at the top, then comes China, then India, and then we have Russia, and then we have UK at 5th position. Then apart from that, nuclear weapon stockpile, let's look at that. According to the latest SIPRI report, I think came out this month only. if I'm not wrong, in the month of October in 2022. But according to the 2021 SIPRI report, which I have updated it here, Russia has the largest nuclear weapon stockpile. Russia has, these are the approximate numbers, of course. So Russia has got 6,257 nuclear weapons. US has 5,600, China has 350, France has 290 according to 2021. UK has 225, Pakistan is having 5 to 10 more nuclear weapons than us. So 165. India's nuclear weapon stockpile is 160. Then we have Israel at 90 and North Korea at 45. Okay. So according to that, Russia has the most nuclear weapons, then US. And please remember that in the year 1985, there were in total of 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world. These nuclear weapons were later on, disbanded, disarmed and all. So now roughly 13,000 something nuclear weapons are there in the world. And this was a very dangerous situation back in 1985 when Cold War was going on. Now we have seen all these, data, this factual stuff with respect to the world. I think it is important for us to focus on India's neighbor first of all. And when it comes to India's neighborhood, China is also our direct neighbor. So I'm going to take China also in this. And I think with respect to China, we have already learnt the GDP of China, $16 trillion roughly, and the defense expenditure of China, which is $252 billion last year. Then with respect to India, the GDP is currently $3.25 trillion. Okay, we are aspiring for becoming a $5 trillion economy by 2025. That's our aim, that's our objective. And defense expenditure, last year we have spent $72.9 billion in defense. Okay, and it is growing. Okay, so this is South Asian map. If you can see, this is India, then we have Nepal, we have Bhutan, we have Bangladesh, and there is Myanmar here. Myanmar is also called as Burma, by the way. We don't refer to it as Burma, but in most of the American textbooks, you will find the mention of the term Burma here. Then we have Sri Lanka. This is our maritime neighbor. We have Maldives, and we have Pakistan, and Afghanistan is also our direct neighbor. But this part that you are seeing, this is right now disputed between Pakistan and India. We call it as POK, Pakistani Occupied Kashmir. But if we look at that, if we include it in India, so we have a direct access, direct connectivity with Afghanistan. So how many countries are there in South Asia? You'll see there are in total of 8 countries in South Asia, including India. And these are India, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Afghanistan, Bhutan, and Maldives, and Bangladesh. So GDP wise, if you think about it, Bhutan has the lowest GDP, that is $2.5 billion only. Whereas Pakistan GDP, it is a third world country, okay? So, but the GDP is $346 billion. Nepal's GDP is $33 billion. Sri Lankan GDP, $84 billion. And this economic crisis that has happened in Sri Lanka, so keeping that in mind, we'll be discussing Sri Lanka in future. Afghanistan GDP is again very low, $18 billion only. Maldives GDP $3.74 billion, and Bangladesh GDP is $323 billion. And apart from this, other facts that you must remember is that India shares the largest border with Bangladesh. We share our largest border with Bangladesh, and our second largest border is with China. Our second largest border is with China. And in this particular session, we'll start with China. China is a major global center of power. So in bilateral context, I told you that we will be focusing on, first of all, the major centers of power, that is China, Japan, all these countries will be focusing on. Okay, so let us start with China. Now India and China are strategic partners. Okay, we have officially announced this, that we are strategic partners, and we are strategic partners since 2003. Now you'll be asking this question that, ma'am, we are strategic partners and yet we have so many issues. There are a lot of area of dispute. So how can we be strategic partners in that context? Like, we should be aligned on almost all the fronts. But that's the beauty of strategic partnership. So please understand that there is a difference between strategic partnership and strategic ally. So when I say that you have a strategic partnership with any country, that means in some specific areas which you have decided, only in those areas you will be having the same agenda or the same perspective or similar, you can say that, alignment. Okay, you'll be aligned with each other only in those matters. In rest of the matters, there is flexibility. So that means strategic partnership offers flexibility to the nation. Flexibility to the nation. So for whatever actions that are taken by your partner, you will not be held responsible for it. That's the beauty of strategic partnership, and that is why in the wake of this in the beginning of 21st century, most of the countries have preferred to go for strategic partnership. So we are strategic partners with Japan, we have strategic partnership with European Union, we have strategic partnership with US, we have strategic partnership with China as well. So strategic partnership will offer us flexibility. That means because of the complex interdependence, because of the fact that we have disputes as well as areas of cooperation, we require flexibility. So in certain areas, India and China are working together, but those are, some limited areas only. We have a lot of issues. That is why the relationship that we have with China is highly, you can say that we are complexly interdependent. This is not independent. Interdependent is the term that you must write here. Complexly interdependent. That means we have issues, but at the same time we are cooperating with each other in some areas. And the issues, these are the most important to cover. It takes a lot of time to cover these issues. So we'll start with, first of all, what are the major issues? Like there is border dispute that we will be covering. We have trade deficit with China, that is again a disputed issue. Like last year, our trade has crossed, 100 billion mark with China. Last year, we did $125 billion of trade for the first time. And there is a trade deficit that India is having with China, which means that we have imported a lot from China and we have exported a lot less to China. So we have a trade deficit. We'll be coming on that. What are the things we are importing? What are the things we are exporting? Everything related to that we'll be covering. But let's look at all the other issues that we'll be studying in this series. So apart from that, we'll be studying border dispute. Okay, we'll be discussing water dispute with China. This is absolutely important. Brahmaputra dispute, what are the issues, what are the challenges, because these days China is mentioned as a hydro hegemon. There's a reason why China has taken over, Tibet. Officially, India has recognized that Tibet is part of China. Tibet is China only. Okay, we'll be coming to that as well. Then we have South China Sea dispute. South China Sea dispute, we'll be looking at that. Understanding it, what are the disputed parties. India is not a disputed party in South China Sea, but why it is so significant for us, why India raised its voice with respect to this dispute. Okay, and what does India stand for when it comes to South China Sea. Then we have Doklam standoff, which took place in 2017. We will be also exploring that, we'll be discussing it. Apart from that, we will be also discussing string of pearls policy, very, very important strategy. Although it has not been officially accepted by China, not officially announced by them, but foreign policy experts in India, they talk about the presence of this sort of a strategy, string of pearls policy by China. And a response to this string of pearls policy is necklace of diamond strategy. So what is this necklace of diamond strategy? That also we will be covering in this chapter, in this series. Apart from that, under India-China relations, we'll be also discussing Belt and Road Initiative. We will be discussing this China-Pakistan economic corridor, and also the Chinese presence in South Asia will be discussed. There will be a lot of terms like we'll be understanding what is this debt trap diplomacy, what is this term called as checkbook diplomacy, you know all those things we'll try to understand. What are the issues here? Why do you think China is so interested in South Asia these days? We'll be discussing that. Then we will also understand one China policy. We'll also discuss Tibetan issue. We'll discuss the problems China is having with respect to Dalai Lama. Apart from that, we will also discuss Hong Kong crisis. We'll discuss 1989 Tiananmen Square issue. We'll also discuss Uyghur Muslim issue. We'll discuss China-Pakistan axis which exists. NSG, NPT, CTBT. We will discuss United Nations Security Council reforms. How China is blocking that. China is not in favor of expansion of United Nations Security Council permanent membership. So what's the issue behind it? Also in context of NSG, why China is blocking India's membership. That's something which is worth noting. We have to understand this whole issue. And maritime security of India, domination of Indian Ocean, how it is so important, specifically in connection to Indo-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific region. Other topics, we will be discussing Quad, we'll be discussing AUKUS, we'll be discussing Five Eyes Alliance. These are some small topics that I think one should know while discussing India-China relations. And of course, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, AIIB, will be discussing BRICS, will be discussing the significance of New Development Bank, which is NDB. What is the significance of that? What are the recent, initiatives taken by the government to counter China, right? In terms of 5G, what is the whole issue? We'll be talking about that as well. So these are some of the issues that you will find, we'll be discussing in the upcoming series of international relation. Now, apart from these major issues between India and China, there are certain areas of cooperation, which I think I've mentioned: AIIB, SCO, BRICS, trade related, as well as climate change. In terms of WTO reforms, what's the issue? We'll be talking about that as well. Okay? So, China is referred to as a dragon, and India is sometimes referred to as an elephant. You may also find the mention of India as a tiger, okay? But most of the time Indian elephant is mentioned and Chinese dragon is mentioned. Okay, so let's first of all talk about trade, because trade is something which is practically we need to be aware of what is going on, on practical grounds, like what's the reality, because the present world order is based upon economy. It's an economic world order, and keeping that in mind, economic growth is very important. So I think our national interests are largely guided by that, largely guided around economic growth, largely guided around trade. So let's dive deep into it. Now, if you look at India's trade with China in 2021, for the first time it crossed $125 billion. In fact, few days ago, this was in news, I think 2 to 3 days ago, it was there in news that within the 9 month of 2022, we have already crossed $100 billion mark, and there are 3 months still to go, like October, November, December. Whatever trade will take place here right now has not been taken into account, but we have already marked $100 billion of trade, which means, I mean, after even after the clashes, the Galwan clashes, the military clashes that we had with China, our relation with China was at the lowest, but our trade was growing. And keeping that in mind, India's trade last year crossed $125 billion with China, with imports from China at a record of $100 billion, around that. Okay. And which means that still there is a large demand for Chinese goods, particularly machinery in India. And this has happened when the relations hit new low due to the standoff by the militaries in eastern Ladakh last year. So, what are the biggest exports to China and the biggest imports from China? Let's talk about that. Now, what we have exported to China in the recent years, when it comes to exports, it is dominated by iron ore. Apart from iron ore, it is cotton, and other raw material based commodities, which have seen a recovery in demand in China last year. Okay. So we are exporting iron ore, petroleum products, organic chemicals, spices, marine products, iron and steel, aluminium, telecom instruments, and residual chemicals mostly. But we have been importing what? Well, India has imported a large quantity of electronic components, electrical and mechanical machinery, like telecom instruments, computer hardware. Apart from that, active pharmaceutical ingredients, which is API, the bulk drug and drug intermediates, APIs. Actually, India is known as pharmacy of the world, and we produce cheap and affordable and very effective generic medicines. And to produce these, to manufacture generic medicines, we require APIs. So APIs are the active pharmaceutical ingredients without which generic medicine production is not possible. So this is something that we have imported a lot. Apart from that, auto components, we have imported that. And apart from that, a range of medical supplies, from oxygen concentrators to personal protective equipment, the PPE kits. So these are the things that we have imported. Okay. So these are the exports and import. But let us compare that with other countries. Like, what is the trade that China is having with US, with European Union, with ASEAN? If you compare that with Indian China trade, it will look very little. It won't matter. Like, for example, if you look at trade figures with China's top three trading partners, China has the highest trade. China has with ASEAN. If you look at China ASEAN trade, ASEAN is the top trading partner of China. It stands at $878 billion. Very, very important. So that means 28% of the trade China is having with ASEAN. And apart from that, if we look at China European Union, then it stands at $828 billion, $50 billion less than that. And if we look at China and US trade, it is 28.7% of it with US, that it is somewhere around $755 billion. $755 billion. So what we see is that China is having its trade with ASEAN, EU and US, which is far above than what it is having with India. So which means there is a lot of potential between India and China. They can grow their trade further. Now, last year we have registered a trade deficit of $69.38 billion. This is the trade deficit. What is trade deficit? Trade deficit means a situation where the country's import dues exceed the receipts from the exports. Okay? And India has been very vocal about it. India has been highlighting its concerns over the growing trade deficit with China for over a decade. And that's why, India has been calling on China to open its markets for India's IT and pharmaceutical products. So, if that happens, then probably this trade deficit that we have with China will come down. It will come down. Now, okay, let's talk about India and China timeline. Okay, then we'll talk about maybe in the coming time, in the coming series of these lessons, we'll be talking about what is happening in China right now, what can you expect in the near future, like in which direction the relation can progress. But for us, we need to understand the timeline. So when I say timeline from 1947 till 2022, whatever developments have happened, we are going to focus on that. So, like I said earlier, that if we look at the official status of India-China relationship, they are strategic partners since 2003. And what is the scope of strategic partnership? Well, their strategic partnership is based upon creation of a multipolar world order, which means challenging US hegemony, like in 2003. So you may say that, okay, we are working with US to counter China. So how can you say, we also want to challenge US hegemony? Because we stand for multipolarity. We don't want any single country to be dominant or hegemonic in this world. India believes in cosmopolitan union. India believes in multipolarity. Officially, we have been saying that. Okay, so in that context, we are engaging, of course, with China, and we are cooperating with them in multilateral institutions. Like both India and China want reforms in IMF, in World Bank, in WTO, in climate change. Now, these are the areas where US has dominant position. US position in IMF, its quota in IMF is the dominant one. Same as in World Bank, same as with WTO. Those provisions are there in WTO which favors US. Okay, so therefore, what is the scope of our strategic partnership? As of now, on paper, it is creation of multipolar world order. And what is the actual state of relationship that we have with China? Well, China is a biggest challenge. It is the biggest challenge for India's foreign policy makers. In fact, there's a huge probability of a conventional war that can happen between India and China. So there is something called as conventional war and there is something called as unconventional war. Conventional war means, when you are going to use tanks and, guns and everything on ground, you will use those things. That is conventional war. Okay. But when you use nuclear weapons, biological weapons, something like this, that is unconventional war. So there's a high probability of a conventional war happening between India and China. In fact, there's a Chinese proverb. The Chinese proverb, which is written in Sun's, in book Art of War, which is written by Sun Tzu. Actually, Sun Tzu is the realist. Okay, just like we have Kautilya in Indian context, he is a realist. Similarly, there is Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu is a Chinese realist thinker. And in this book, Art of War, he has written this proverb that there cannot be two tigers in one mountain. So here, one mountain means the Asian continent and two tigers means that in Asia, in the Asian continent, only China and India are powerful enough to, counter each other, or you can say that they're powerful, they are competitive enough, like they can compete with each other. But according to that, there cannot be two tigers in one mountain. That means there can be only one power which will be acting as a regional power in Asia. It can be either China or India. At present, if I have to say practically, I'll simply say that China is definitely powerful than India at present. Okay, we are talking about in practical terms what the foreign policy experts have been saying. So there is a term called as power asymmetry. Power asymmetry. So when we talk about power asymmetry, it means that China is having asymmetrical power. Asymmetrical means China is more powerful than that of India. Like if you look at economy, GDP wise, if you look at that, then China is definitely powerful because in terms of economy, China's economy stands at 16 to 17 trillion dollars. Whereas if we compare that with India, it is somewhere around 3.25 billion dollars as of now. Now, apart from GDP, if we look at other things, like let's talk about defense expenditure. Now, defense expenditure wise, I told you China's last year defense expenditure was $2.252 billion, whereas India's defense expenditure, it stood at 72.9 billion dollars. So GDP wise it is this, defense expenditure wise it is this. So if you compare that, if you compare China with India, well, you'll get to know that China's GDP is 5 times more than that of India, and defense expenditure wise, China's defense expenditure, China is 3 times ahead of India. Okay? So it is 5 times and it is 3 times. 5 times and 3 times. China is ahead of India. So these are the facts, these are the figures on the basis of which we can say that China is ahead and there is power asymmetry that exists. Okay? Or we can use another term, asymmetrical accumulation of power between India and China. China is more powerful. Okay? Then we'll be talking about border disputes and other things as well. Okay, but as of now, just remember these facts. Now we'll be talking about border disputes. We'll be looking at that. But I think before going into that, let us finish the timeline. Like I said that 1947 when India got independent, and I talked about the strategic partnership that we have since 2003. So India got independent in 1947, and 2 years later in 1949 a civil war was going on in China, and this civil war ended in China in 1949. And this is the civil war where actually Kuomintang party of China, which wanted to establish democracy in China, was fighting with Communist Party of China, which was highly supported by Russia. And because of the Russian support, because of the support of Soviet Union, at that time Communist Party of China is going to win. As a result of which, the civil war which ended, Communist Party of China will come to power. And who was heading Communist Party? It was headed by Mao Zedong. So Mao Zedong, he had his own vision of China. Mao Zedong, being the first president of China, had this concept of palms and digit concept. Palms and digit concept, according to which he claimed a lot of regions like Tibet, Aksai Chin, Sikkim, Nepal, Bhutan, Arunachal Pradesh. All these were claimed by him, that all these are part of China, that these are the palms and digits of China. Digit as in fingers. I'll be talking about it, but as of now just have this idea that he will come to power. And 1950s, then very next year, he'll start taking control of Tibet slowly and steadily, and by 1959 he'll completely occupy Tibet. Now this is the significance of Tibet. We'll be talking about why Tibet is so important. all these things in the upcoming sessions, but as of now, just remember this thing, that under the palms and digit concept, under this, he decided to invade Tibet. Okay, so that was Tibet invasion. That started in 1950. But it is in the same year, in 1950, 1st of April 1950, India and China established the diplomatic relationship. In fact, 2020 is when we finished like 70 years of our relationship. So this year we have now 72 years of diplomatic relationship with China. And one unique aspect is that India was the first non socialist country to establish relations with People's Republic of China. In fact, there was a catchphrase at that time which became famous, that is Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai. Actually, that was the time when we had Nehru as our, prime minister, and Nehru was an idealist. Who is an idealist? Idealist is a person who believes in, you can say that, who has a lot of faith in multilateral institutions, and on top of it, that person who believes in cooperation with other countries, with other states. So his vision, Nehru's vision was, taking India on a global level. His objective was that India will become a developed country by the year 2000, and India will also become a global power by the year 2000. So that was his vision, and keeping that in mind, such sort of steps and actions or policies were promoted by Nehru, those who were in line with the idealist ideology. Idealist, or more of a liberal institutions. He believed in that. Liberal in the sense, in terms of, human rights, in terms of peace, in terms of cooperation. He believed in those ideas. And that's why India was the first non-socialist countries to establish relationship with PRC, and he thought that China will not be a challenge for us. So, although at that time Sardar Patel was there, and Sardar Patel was skeptical about the position of China, he warned Nehru that China will attack us. Okay, so we should be prepared. But being an idealist, and he had, very limited options. India got independent in 1947, and our economy was, it was not well at all. High level of poverty, malnutrition, all these things were there. That's why whatever limited resources we had, Nehru thought that those resources should be spent on, the development of the masses, to uplift the masses from poverty, as well as to, develop our manufacturing sector, whatever resources we had. That is why he did not want to waste those resources on, he did not want to spend those resources in defense expenditure. He could have gone for it, but he decided to invest it. Okay, and that's why, as the leader of our country, his ambitions were, in a very positive light. If we look at that, ambitions were actually good. Okay, he opted for self-sufficiency. He did not have any realist ambitions, no expansionist foreign policy, nothing like that. That's why he went for self-sufficiency, and he recognized China. PRC, he recognized it, and started its relationship, established diplomatic relationship with it. Then he visited 1954. When he visited China, and that's when he promoted this, signed this Panchsheel agreement of mutual coexistence, peaceful coexistence, and mutual, understanding. Next year, 1955, both the countries attended Asian African Conference, in which 29 countries participated in Bandung in Indonesia, and jointly advocated the Bandung spirit of solidarity, friendship, and cooperation. And it is from there NAM, started. So it has led to the decolonization of the whole of Asia and Africa, to the formation of non-aligned movement as the third way. Actually, the whole world was divided into two power blocks. On one side there was US, on the other side there was USSR. So this was the third way. NAM was the third way. And the first NAM summit happened. This conference took place in Yugoslavia in Belgrade in 1961. Okay, so these things were happening. Then what happened? 1962 is when the border conflict between India and China led to a serious setback in bilateral relations. And after this, for the next 10 years, there will be a complete silence. You know, no engagement at all. That happened. I mean, for 10 years, there was complete silence between both the countries, both the parties. Then 1976 is when, for the first time after the war, China and India restored ambassadorial relations and bilateral ties improved gradually. Then, in 1988, Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi visited China. He initiated the process of normalization of bilateral relations, and that's when the two sides agreed to look forward and develop bilateral relations actively in other fields while seeking a mutually acceptable solution to boundary questions. Then in 1992, Indian President Venkataraman visited China. He was the first president who visited, an important development. Now this is very very important. 1996 development, when Chinese president visited India. He was the first head of the state from China who visited India after the establishment of bilateral ties. In fact, there was an agreement that was signed, and this agreement was on confidence building measures, which are today termed as CBM. Confidence building measures in military field along the line of actual control. Actually, confidence building measure is when you are about to do any military exercise, any military drill, you basically notify the other party that we are planning to do this or we are planning to do that, something like that. So you notify it to the other party, you let them know about your intentions so that they are aware about it, so that any sort of a miscommunication does not take place. So they decided to go for CBM. Then in 2000, then Indian president visited China, 50 years of relationship. 2008, when both India and China shared vision for 21st century. 2010, we celebrated 60th anniversary. 2011, China India exchange year was celebrated. 2012, which was marked as the year of China India friendship and cooperation. 2015, when two sides met on the sidelines of 7th BRICS summit in Ufa, Russia, and China decided to open Nathula Pass, which is in Sikkim. By the way, an important development happened in between here in 2003, when we officially announced that we are strategic partners, and it is at that time Sikkim was officially recognized by China as a state of India. Actually, Sikkim used to be disputed earlier between India and China. I mean, Mao Zedong used to claim it as a part of Chinese territory, but in 2003 they have officially recognized Sikkim as a part of India. Then apart from that, if you look at the year 2018, Chinese president held an informal meeting with Indian Prime Minister in Wuhan. This meeting was set up, and that's when Indian Prime Minister visited China to attend the Shanghai Cooperation Summit. So since then the engagement has been very, we are actively engaging with them. Then there was second informal meeting that was there which reaffirmed the Wuhan consensus. Like, it reflected that both the nations, India and China, are ready to build a closer partnership for development. So slowly and steadily we progressed, but then clashes and everything also happened at the same time. That's why the relationship that we have with China is complexly interdependent. And 2020 is when it marked the year of 70th anniversary. And that's when people to people exchanges, all these things were promoted. Not that important, but this is very important. In terms of expert commentaries, there is foreign ambassador Sham Saran. Sham Saran has written a book. The name of the book is How India Sees the World. And it is in this book he explains to us what is China's strategic culture. So he compares India's and China's perception. According to Sham Saran, India see this world in the form of mandals. What do you understand by mandals? Mandal is a term which is used in ancient text for states. So when he says that India sees this world in the form of mandals, that means whenever India looks at this world, according to India, there are different mandals in this world. Okay, different mandals. Mandals as in there are multiple states. So M for mandal, M for multiple states. So that means whenever we look at the world, we don't look at the world as if we are on the top of the world. Rather, we give importance to multipolarity. Multiple states, we recognize that this world is made up of multiple states. And each mandal has its own dweep, has its own island. And at the center of this world lies Jambu Dweep. Jambu Dweep. Jambu Dweep in the sense, like at the center of the world, if you think about it, European continent is connected, there's a land connectivity between European continent and Asian continent, and it is also connected with African continent, right? So think of Europe, Asia and Africa as a Jambu Dweep. So at the center of this world, according to Sham Saran, lies Jambu Dweep. And Jambu Dweep, where he describes that this same idea has been described in our sacred text as four-petaled lotus. Okay, so in our ancient Indian textbook also, it has been mentioned like this, that there is a Jambu Dweep at the center of this world, and that is the four-petaled lotus, which is floating in the ocean, which is floating in the planet, on the planet Earth. Okay, imagine Africa, Europe and Asia like this. And Bharatvarsh is a southern petal in this. So that means whenever India looks at the world in the Jambu Dweep, which lies at the center of the earth, India is the southern petal. And apart from India, there can be other mandals, there can be other petals. It can be China, it can be Russia, it can be any other state. But Bharatvarsh, that is India, is one of the southern petal. Thus, India never sees itself at the center, rather just as a petal, which reflects multipolar nature of the world, right? On the other hand, he says, China always sees itself as the center of the world. That means China suffers from middle kingdom complex. Like China wants to be at the center of this world, to be at the top of the world, dominate others, So such is the saying in this book, How India Sees the World. Okay, so Sham Saran is saying that China is suffering from this middle kingdom complex. That means China has an ambition to create a Sino-centric world order. For example, there was a American-centric, US-centric world order when American hegemony we started seeing, 90s till 2001. So America was dictating everything. So in those terms, if we think about China, Sham Saran says that China has an ambition to create a Sino-centric world. And if not in the world, at least in Asia, China wants to be dominating. And India is the only country which can challenge China's aspirations. India is the only country in that context. Hence, China wants India to remain contained in South Asia, and that is one of the reasons why China's presence we witness in South Asia, like in Bangladesh, in Myanmar, in Nepal, in Bhutan, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, in Maldives. Why China is so active around all these countries? Because if China will be present there, China will be dominating in these region, anti-India elements, or sentiments will be promoted, something like this, to contain India within South Asia. If India remains contained in South Asia, remains busy, in stabilizing South Asian region, it will not be able to challenge China in Asian continent. That's the whole idea. That's why China is so active in South Asia. And it is also connected with China's string of pearls policy. String of pearls policy, which is nothing but to encircle India. Encircle India. Now, what's the significance? Why that is happening? This we will cover in the upcoming sessions. But I hope you understood this idea, which is promoted by Shyam Saran. Now, we'll be also discussing other, ideas. Like there are 3 schools of thought of how Indian scholars look at China. There are idealists like Rabindranath Tagore and Pandit Nehru. They are idealists. So they always used to talk about Asian century. And according to them, China, India and Japan, that these can work together to bring Asian century. To bring Asian century. Actually, for a very long period of time, Atlantic region, was the center of the world order, right? But now this has shifted towards Indo-Pacific region, towards Asian century. So keeping that in mind, India, Japan, India, China and Japan can work together, and they can bring about Asian century where Asia can dominate. Now that's the idea. They will cooperate. That is why they are idealist. Then comes realist. Sardar Patel is a realist. Sardar Patel, I told you, warned Pandit Nehru that China is irredentist. Irredentist means a land grabbing country. The China always had expansionist culture, and the only way to deal with China is to remain prepared for war. And then there is another school of thought, pragmatic school of thought, which is dominated by Shyam Saran and C. Raja Mohan. These are 2 very important foreign policy experts that we have to quote in India-China relations, in India-Afghanistan, in India-Africa, India-Latin America, India-US. Their opinions are very important for us being a student of PSIR optional. So, as far as pragmatic school is concerned, both of them recognize that China is both a challenge and an opportunity for India. So what you need to do, you need to take this stand always. So if there's going to be any question, you simply, suggestions if you want to give, you give pragmatic school stand. So you may say that India's policy should be of congagement. Congagement means that we should engage with China wherever it is possible, and we should contain China wherever necessary. So wherever engagement with China is not possible, then we should try to contain China in that context. Okay, so this is it for this video, guys. In the next session, we'll try to continue. Specifically, I'll be focusing on border dispute and other issues, area of issues between India and China. So this is it for this session, and if you want to cover full syllabus of PSIR optional, you can subscribe on Unacademy Plus. All the notes and everything will be provided along with answer writing sessions and test series for you guys. Okay. So if you are planning to take a subscription on Unacademy for PSIR optional, you may use my code, which is Ashna Sisodia. You will be able to get extra discount on your subscription. And by the way, you can also take only optional subscription on Plus. So Yes, that's it. Let's meet tomorrow. Thank you very much. Bye bye. Take care.